Thanks, Alex, for that very generous introduction. And also thanks to the School Events Office for arranging and organizing everything today. I want to start by thanking family and friends for attending today, especially my wife, Michelle. And I'd like to thank my son, Sam, who unfortunately is not able to be here today for various reasons. I'd like to thank my dad for flying up all the way from the balmy south of France to slightly chillier Scottish spring to attend today, and James, my brother, for coming all the way from south of England. I have far too many academic debts to mention, but I cannot not mention my old DPhil supervisor at Oxford, the late great Roy Park, whose absolute brilliance as a supervisor I didn't really appreciate until after I graduated. I also want to mention colleagues with whom I've collaborated on various projects over the years, particularly Felicity James at Leicester and Kerry Sinanan at Winnipeg. And of course, I'd like to give a huge thanks to colleagues old and new in the Department of English Literature, basically for just being a great bunch of people to work with. Thank you to all. This is starting to sound like a retirement speech, actually. And thanks for everybody for coming today. I hope it's interesting. We'll see. So I'm going to talk today about my work on Romantic literature and philosophy and how it's evolved over the past 20 years or so. In attempting to tie together what in many ways is quite a dog-eared story of digressions and dead ends, I'm going to focus on a single idea, creation ex nihilo, or creation from nothing. And the reason for focusing on creation is that this idea, which was the main focus of my DPhil work back in the 1990s, has unexpectedly cropped up again in my latest research project. This is where I find out whether the clicker's working. There we go. What, I hear you ask, is so important about the idea of creation ex nihilo? Well, I'm going to try and make a bold argument here. I'm going to try and go out on a limb. I think the idea of creation ex nihilo as a model for literary and artistic creativity enables a new concept of literature to emerge at the beginning of the 19th century. A concept of literature that for convenience I'm calling, but I want to make absolutely clear the Romantics absolutely did not call literature with a capital L. That's not all, because ultimately it's this concept of literature that is encoded in the discipline of English literature as we study it today, as we still do. What I'm going to suggest then is that the Romantic idea of creation from nothing forms the historical condition of possibility for the emergence of English literature as a discipline. I'll also briefly suggest that it's one of the reasons why the discipline of English literature is often seen as lacking propriety. Before closing with some remarks on why Romantic poets like Percy Shelley thought literature's very impropriety was something that was worth defending. Now, when I started my DPhil, which was much longer ago than I care to remember, it was because I was intrigued by comments such as this one by William Wordsworth. Genius is the introduction of a new element into the intellectual universe. Now, actually, in context, this kind of bold declaration is more hedged and qualified. But nonetheless, it seemed to me that Wordsworth and other writers of the Romantic period were making a kind of argument that hadn't been made before about how knowledge progresses, or in fact doesn't progress. Because one of the things that struck me at the time was how this idea seemed to challenge the idea of knowledge as progressive, as building steadily upon the accumulated gains of previous scientific and philosophical achievements. For Wordsworth, the creation of poetic truth was instead achieved by a kind of divine fiat. The poet introduced some new element into the universe, not by building on established knowledge, but by spontaneously producing it from nothing. I should sort of register two caveats at this point. The first is that the idea that poetic genius creates from nothing wasn't some kind of creed. I'm not arguing that it's some kind of creed that was shared by all writers in this period, by Lord Byron, for example, or Jane Austen, or Charles Lamb, or Charlotte Smith. In fact, I would say that it's probably actually a minority view. The second caveat is that the idea that the artist or poet is creative in the sense of making things up is obviously hardly new. In ancient Greece, the philosopher Plato had cited the tendency of poets to make up stories, lying about the gods, as he saw it, as one reason for excluding them from his ideal republic. Even the idea that poets create, as it were, from nothing wasn't new. Sir Philip Sidney had already got there in 1595 in his Apology for Poetry, where he wrote that only the poet doth grow in effect another nature, in making things either better than nature bringeth forth, or quite new forms such as never were in nature. Yeah. But these caveats don't make the idea any less important. True, the idea of the poetic genius as a kind of ex nihilo creator wasn't universally accepted at the time. But ex nihilo creativity would become central to what we now view as romantic aesthetics, thanks to the work of thinkers such as Samuel Taylor Coleridge and his massive influence upon subsequent literary theory. Secondly, there was actually something new about the way in which writers like Coleridge adopted the idea of creation ex nihilo. Yes, the idea that the poet created from nothing had been circulating before the 19th century, that's certainly true. But this applied only to fiction, a domain in which truth and falsehood is not an issue. Before Romanticism, the division of labor between poets and scientists, or natural philosophers, was fairly clear-cut. Natural philosophers discovered truths that already existed, but were previously unknown. Poets either made things up that weren't true, or by holding the mirror up to nature, imitated existing truths. For writers like Coleridge, however, what distinguished poetic genius is that it created new truths. It added something new to reality. It was this reality-changing, truth-constructing element that was the radically new component of Wordsworth's claim that poetic genius is the introduction of a new element into the intellectual universe. So, in my DPhil thesis, I examined the ways in which writers of the period struggled to accommodate and justify this new model of artistic creativity. Yeah. In my first monograph, Knowledge and Indifference in English Romantic Prose, I broadened out this inquiry to consider its wider implications for the relationship between philosophy and literature. Now here I was influenced by a book originally published in French way back in 1978, but still influential today. Philippe Lacoue-Labat and Jean-Luc Nancy's The Literary Absolute. Now, Lacoue-Labat and Nancy's arguments in this book are actually mainly about German Romanticism, but they apply equally in a British context. Their main claim is basically this: by rejecting the communication of knowledge as the foundation of literary art, Romanticism creates the idea of literature itself as a genre. So this is them. Beyond divisions and all definition, this genre is thus programmed in Romanticism as the genre of literature, the genericity, so to speak, and the generativity of literature, grasping and producing themselves in an entirely new, infinitely new work. The absolute, therefore, of literature. So, in this way, literature undergoes a revolution in its status between the 18th and the 19th centuries. That is, from what I'm calling literature with a lowercase l to literature with a capital L, for kind of convenience. For an 18th century writer like Samuel Johnson, literature, as defined in his 1755 Dictionary of the English Language, was decidedly lowercase l. It meant simply learning, skill in letters. 4 years later, the Reverend Hugh Blair gave the first of his lectures in rhetoric and belles lettres here at Edinburgh, arguably the first lectures in English literature. Or were they? For Blair, the study of what he called the study of polite literature provided useful knowledge in the cultivation of taste, eloquence, and virtue. And yet, over 60 years later, we find a very different conception of literature being outlined by the Romantic essayist Thomas de Quincey. De Quincey complains in one of his essays for the London Magazine in 1823 about this word literature. He says, "The word literature is a perpetual source of confusion because it's used in two senses, and those senses liable to be confounded with each other. In a philosophical use of the word, literature is the direct and adequate antithesis of books of knowledge. But in a popular use, it's a mere term of convenience for expressing inclusively the total books in a language. In this latter sense, a dictionary, a grammar, a spelling book, an almanac belong to the literature." So effectively dismissing Samuel Johnson's sense of literature as all learning, everything written, De Quincey insists on a new philosophical sense of literature. And it's in this sense, as what De Quincey calls the direct and adequate antithesis of books of knowledge, that the Romantics invented what I'm now referring to as kind of capitalized literature. Not as everything written, not even as what the Reverend Blair called polite literature, but as a kind of writing with a special quality, one that conferred upon it a kind of higher, even transcendent value. Now, this value in turn depended upon the creative power of the writer. The problem with this power was that it was wrapped in mystery. Now, it's telling here that De Quincey initially defines this new sense of literature negatively as the antithesis of knowledge, because pinning down what this something else was that made literature so special, in his sense, the special quality proved to be very difficult. Put simply, he was trying to come up with a new answer to an old Philistine question. What's so special about King Lear and Paradise Lost? If it's not knowledge that is communicated fundamentally, what does one get from these works of great literature that one does not find in a dictionary or an almanac? In an unpublished and undated manuscript, De Quincey had another stab at this. And he defines this elusive quality as power, or the communication of what he calls an incommunicable excellence of human character. This quality, he claims, is always found in a true literature reflecting human nature, not as it represents, but as it wills, not as a passive mirror, but as a self-moving power. So by identifying the defining characteristic of this new idea of literature as power rather than the representation of truth, De Quincey opens up a domain for literature based on human creativity, its self-moving power, rather than its ability to represent reality. Once merely the medium for the transmission of truth, as it was for Johnson, literature in De Quincey's hands now assumes a privileged relationship with truth. This kind of capital L literature becomes, in Lucula Bar Nancy's terms, the absolute of everything written, of all literature, including philosophy. As Lucula Bar Nancy argue, this is the reason Romanticism implies something entirely new, the production of something entirely new. The Romantics never really succeed in naming this something. They speak of poetry, of the work, of the novel, or of Romanticism. In the end, they decide to call it, all things considered, literature. So what I was trying to do in my first book was connect Lucula Bar and Nancy's claim about the romantic invention of literature in the literary absolute to my thesis about radical creation. Literature with a capital L achieves autonomy, I claimed, because unlike lowercase literature, it creates from nothing. Consequently, literature in this sense has nothing to communicate. It has no knowledge that it wants to convey, nothing beyond its own creativity as writing, its own endless generativity, as Lucula Bar and Nancy say. So my thesis and my first book shared a key assumption. And that was that this idea of epistemological creation ex nihilo, this idea of creating new truths from nothing, pulling wisdom out of the void, was inherently paradoxical. And that all the attempts made by Romantic writers to make sense of it, to rationalize it, to theorize it, were ultimately doomed to fail. In my second book, The Truth About Romanticism, my view shifted. And this was for two reasons. The first reason was that at this point, I was reading a lot of neo-pragmatist philosophy by thinkers like the late Richard Rorty. As part of a long tradition of American pragmatist philosophy, Rorty saw truth not as the object of inquiry, but as something that was created, for better or worse, he thought for the worse, by human language. If truth is itself just a linguistic fiction, albeit not a very useful one, according to Rorty, then there's nothing paradoxical about claiming it's created. For Rorty, truth was just a tool like any other tool, and it was a tool that humanity no longer really needed. On these terms, he claimed, we should follow the Romantics and recognize that truth was something created or made rather than found. As he puts it, from Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, if we could ever become reconciled to the idea that the human self is created by use of a vocabulary, rather than being adequately or inadequately expressed in a vocabulary, then we should at least have assimilated what was true in the Romantic idea that truth is made rather than found. What is true about this claim is that languages are made rather than found, and that truth is a property of linguistic entities, sentences. Consequently, Rorty insisted that insofar as pragmatism privileged the creative imagination over reason, it was, as he put it, on the side of the Romantics, as a point he liked to make repeatedly throughout his work. The second reason behind my shifting view of Romantic creation theory was my discovery of what I thought was, and to a certain extent still think, was a similar discourse of pragmatism in British thought in the late 18th century and early 19th centuries. Yeah. And it was a tradition that I thought had been neglected by scholars of particularly sort of scholars of philosophical romanticism. And the single most important figure in this movement was the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Now, Bentham argued, albeit a bit later in his career, but he did eventually get around to arguing that ideas like truth should not be seen as representations of real entities in some kind of Platonic sense, but as fictions of belief that had an important role to play within communication. Not just important, essential role to play within communication. Here was a very different concept of creation from nothing. Truth was a miraculous creation, but not of any individual psyche, genius, but of discourse itself. We need the construction of truth as part of the background of our thought. Despite their differences then, Bentham and Rorty seemed united on one point at least. We need truth not as a goal of inquiry, but as a starting point in order to communicate. In The Truth About Romanticism, then, I investigated the ways in which the literature of the period reflected this new pragmatic thinking about creative truth. I focused on the writings of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats, and Percy Shelley in particular, all of whom, like Bentham, had very strong connections to the linguistic reform movement of the Romantic period. In all three poets, I argued, one finds a similar pattern in the way in which they depicted the pragmatic interdependence of truth and communication, something that standard narratives of Romantic idealism tended to skate over. When I finished The Truth About Romanticism, for once, I knew immediately what I wanted to do next. And that was trace this pragmatic discourse of truth back to its 18th century origins. The research that I conducted ultimately led to the publication of my third monograph, The Testimony of Sense. Now, the Testimony of Sense argues that this idea that truth is a socially constructed fiction that human beings really require for communication, that this idea can be traced back to the philosophy of David Hume. Now, Hume's main reputation was as an atheist and skeptic. In his treatise of human nature, he extended this skepticism even to himself, in a sense, his own selfhood, finding that there was ultimately no empirical evidence that the self exists. Turning his empirical method of inquiry upon himself, Hume finds that instead of a kind of substantial thinking self, he encounters merely a gap, a void, lying between thought and experience. As he puts it in this very famous passage from the treatise, "For my part," it's a very compelling passage, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. Our eyes cannot turn in their sockets without varying our perceptions. Now, this gap or cleavage between what we think ourselves to be, what I call myself, as Hume puts it, and what we experience ourselves as, heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, meant that for Hume, if there was a substantial entity called a self, we certainly could have no knowledge of it. Yeah. So much for Hume the skeptic. What's perhaps less well known about Hume is what he did next, which was to completely reorientate philosophy around the idea of social correspondence. For Hume, since locating absolute truth through experience or reason was impossible, truth had to be seen instead as a kind of social construct that regulated human belief and made communication fundamentally possible. Underpinning this construction, in turn, was trust. As Hume explains in an appendix to his inquiries, unspoken trust is the precondition of truth, justice, and language. He compares this tacit arrangement to the relationship between, interestingly, two rowers in a boat. Thus, two men pull the oars of a boat by common convention for common interest, without any promise or contract, so nothing explicit. Thus, gold and silver are made the measures of exchange. Thus, speech and words are fixed by human convention and agreement. This tacit trust between subjects, people, individuals, led Hume to emphasize the performative dimension of rationality. Social truth depended upon consensus, and this in turn rested upon the unspoken observance of the conventions of intersubjective communication. Hence the importance to Hume and other 18th century essayists like Joseph Addison of politeness. Politeness reinforces the social solidarity required for truth. As I chart in the Testimony of Sense, however, by the time the Romantic period, what we think of as the Romantic period, was in full swing in the 1790s, the controversy around the French Revolution had polarized opinion, public discourse to such an extent that it completely put paid to the idea of basing social and epistemological norms on some kind of unspoken social consensus. Instead, writers of this period began to experiment with the idea that norms are created by singular acts of individual genius. The role envisaged for the writer by Wordsworth and Coleridge, then, is not that of maintaining the norms necessary for truth to exist, but that of producing them, of creating them, as it were, ex nihilo. So this brings me back to creation from nothing and literature with a capital L. In my more recent work, I've come back round to the idea that the paradoxes of creation from nothing can't be pragmatically sublimated into trust. And this was partly the result of reading a book that actually came out the same year as the Testimony of Sense, unfortunately, so I didn't have a chance to incorporate it into that book. And that was a book by a philosopher called Robert Brandom called A Spirit of Trust. You can see why I wanted to read that. Full title is A Spirit of Trust, a reading of Hegel's Phenomenology. So when I did read this book, at first I was really kind of heartened and cheered by Brandom's neo-pragmatist reading of the philosopher George Hegel, because it chimed in many ways with my own reading of Hume. Now, Hegel is often seen as quite an authoritarian thinker whose work effectively slams the door on Enlightenment radicalism. But Brandom sees Hegel as actually the ultimate anti-authoritarian thinker. Because, Brandom claims, Hegel argues that all norms are in the end relational. There are no absolute norms. Truth is not some kind of big other sitting in some Platonic realm demanding that we recognize its authority. Instead, this is Brandom reading Hegel, it's determined by relationships and alterity. Consequently, for Hegel, Brandom claims, there are no statuses of authority and responsibility apart from subjects' practical attitudes of taking or treating each other as authoritative and responsible. Now, I was very excited by this because it's very similar to the point I tried to make in the Testimony of Sense about Hume and the performativity of reason. or Hume's ideas about the performativity of reason. As long as everybody is in the boat and pulling on the oars, as it were, we have truth. Similarly, Brandom claims that Hegel reveals how the practices that underpin normativity, as he puts it, are structured by trust, a commitment to practical magnanimity that is revealed to be implicit in talking and acting at all. So it's not some kind of optional thing in a way. It's the precondition of talking and acting at all. Put simply, without trust, there's no truth. However, there's a problem with this idea that truth as a human creation can be reduced in some way to trust. As Slavoj Žižek points out in his critique of Brandom, the trouble with basing the construction of truth in trust is that trust is by definition excessive. It always goes beyond what we strictly speaking believe. Consequently, trust always involves minimum amount of internal friction, bad faith, or as Žižek puts it, a minimum of alienation as a condition of freedom. The only way to think and interact freely implies not only that we rely on shared rules of language and manners, as Brandom argued, but also that we accept these rules as something given of which we are not reflectively aware. If we were to reflect on and negotiate these rules all the time, our freedom would be self-destroyed by its very excess. This minimum of alienation involved in trusting in the fiction of truth reveals that in the end we cannot escape this bind. It turns out that we cannot live without the ethical big other, but nor can we act freely in conformity with it. There's no way out of this paradox. So it seems that creation from nothing, even when treated purely discursively or performatively, is inherently paradoxical. But what I've become interested in recently is in how, rather than this being necessarily always a problem for Romantic writers, they actually came to see an opportunity in this paradox for a kind of normative rebellion, for a kind of volcanic disruption of the epistemological order. This is most clear in the work of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and above all, in his famous definition of the imagination. Now, for Coleridge, the imagination is the seat of creativity in every individual. In his Biographia Literaria, or Biographical Sketches of My Literary Life and Opinions from 1817, he distinguishes between the primary imagination, which constitutes the kind of metaphysical being or essence of the imagination, and the secondary imagination, through which imagination engages with the individual will and kind of actualizes itself in the world. In its primary form, he argues, the imagination repeats the original divine act of self-creation, whereby God summons his own being from nothingness and establishes order from void. And so he writes in Biographia, the primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. I should have put more emphasis on the I am, just saying. I am. In pronouncing I am, God engages in the ultimate performative utterance, bringing himself and the universe into being by declaring his own existence. By claiming that this act repeats itself somehow in the human mind, Coleridge connects the creative and unifying power of human imagination to God's eternal act of creation ex nihilo. Just worth sort of thinking back to Le Coulomb and Nancy's claim that I mentioned at the start of the lecture that romanticism implies something entirely new, the production of something entirely new. This is exactly what Coleridge is about here. Just as God's I am miraculously orders what it creates from nothing, Coleridge's imagination makes the reality it represents. As the seat of artistic activity, the imagination creates works that do not merely reorder pre-existing reality. They add something genuinely new to it, something that did not exist before. By making God's ex nihilo creation the basis of imagination, Coleridge rejected a model of literature as the representation of truth in favor of what might be called the production of truth. Not the production of something, not just something that is entirely new, but something that in some peculiar way is true because it is new. So this is a very odd idea. And my own attempt to understand what's at stake in this kind of puzzling notion has been helped by Nicholas Comperdus's work on what he calls the normativity of the new in philosophical romanticism. As Comperdus argues, the romantic idea of freedom as a new beginning, as he calls it, challenges the basic picture of truth that was shared by many earlier thinkers. According to this earlier picture, what was true because it corresponded to established epistemic standards or norms. Any new candidate for truth had to be verified by normative principles or standards that were themselves law-like. But by basing normativity, your standards of truth, in spontaneity rather than in rules, romantic writers like Coleridge initiated what Comperdus memorably calls the normativity of the new, through which they hoped to articulate freedom as a new self-determining beginning. So, should stop paraphrasing Comperdus and just quote him. As he puts it, the new poses a challenge, a normative challenge, to our sense-making practices. If we insist on thinking that normativity, by normativity means the process by which standards are established, if we insist on thinking that normativity necessarily takes rule-governed or law-like form, we will be unable to recognize or explain the normativity of the new. Put simply then, the new poses a challenge to normativity, the setting of rules, values, and standards, because it cannot be introduced in a law-like way. My claim is that for romantic writers like Coleridge, the challenge posed by the normativity of the new is that it literally comes from nowhere. Normative standards based in pure spontaneity are generated ex nihilo. The reason why this is such a radical departure at the time was that such a picture of how new standards are created violates one of the cornerstones of Enlightenment thought, the principle of sufficient reason. So, and we benefit here from a very elegant statement of the principle of sufficient reason by one of its great exponents, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and this is from his Resume of Metaphysics. And he states, for Leibniz, the principle of sufficient reason is just foundational for human knowledge. And he writes in his resume, there is a reason in nature why something should exist rather than nothing. This is a consequence of the great principle that nothing happens without a reason. Couldn't be more straightforward. But this principle that nothing happens without a reason is very difficult to reconcile with creation ex nihilo, since it's part of the very definition of created truth that it cannot be validated in terms of pre-established norms. It carries with it a normativity of the new that cannot be determined by reason. The significance of this radical novelty for the Romantics is nicely expressed in a very famous passage from one of John Keats's letters, written to Benjamin Bailey in 1817. You may be familiar with this, where Keats says, "I am certain of nothing but of the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of imagination. What the imagination sees as beauty must be truth, whether it existed before or not. For I have the same idea of all our passions as of love. They are all in their sublime, creative of essential beauty." As Keats claims, what the imagination sees as truth must be true, not because it happens to be true, i.e., not because there's a reason for it, not because the imagination has discovered that something is, as a matter of fact, true, but because the imagination makes it true. Created truth, then, is a truth for which, normatively speaking, there is no justification. One may speak of faith, as Coleridge tends to do, or power, as De Quincey does, or beauty, as Keats does. But it is essential to this new idea of, and is integrally part of this new idea of literature with a capital L, as the expression of imagination, that one cannot define its essence. It has none. It can't be rationalized. So I mentioned at the start of the talk that creation ex nihilo had cropped up again in my current research project. So in this final section, I'll explain how. I'll try to explain how. So over the past year or so, I've been working on a project called The Waste of Romanticism, which I hope to turn into a book at some point. Working at the advent of industrial production and mass consumerism, writers of this generation experienced the early effects of commercial waste, and their writing not only reflects the deep connection between early industrialization in Britain and its excesses and discards, but also how the creation of surplus value by capitalism inevitably creates waste, including wasted or redundant humans. Many literary works of the period address the wasting of human lives and habitats by enclosure, the Enclosure Acts, pollution, urbanization, slavery, and war. The Romantic era also coincides with the discovery of geological deep time and the stirrings of evolutionary theories that would rethink humanity's relation to the wasting of the continents and the biosphere. At this point, the history of waste gives way to considerations of waste's ontological significance as a marker of human finitude, of the inevitability of decay, dispersion, and extinction. Now, the topic of waste might seem quite remote from creation ex nihilo, but this distance is less apparent when one thinks of what is created from nothing as a kind of gratuitous excess, a surplus that offends the natural order. Whatever disrupts the continuity of this order or system, what springs from nothing for no reason, for instance, is literally excessive, and so, in a sense, prodigal or wasteful. Yeah. The thing about waste is that it is neither object nor subject, neither organic nor inorganic. Consequently, it constitutes a radically indeterminate zone in which the permeable boundary between the human and the non-human can be negotiated. And it's this disruptive potential of wasteful creativity that I'm interested in. In contesting the waste generated by industrial modernity, Romantic writers cultivate alternative kinds of waste or excessiveness as forms of resistance to ideological power in commercialized society. What I mean by this alternative wastefulness is a kind of purposelessness that could not easily be absorbed into systems of production and consumption, or so these writers hoped. To illustrate what I'm trying to get at, I'm still thinking this through. I want to close with a Romantic poem that celebrates waste in this sense. It's a very famous poem. It's Percy B. Shelley's 1816 sonnet, Ozymandias, one of my favorite poems. Not so much that I've committed it to memory, though. So here it goes. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." Now, Shelley's sonnet is, of course, a celebration of waste, specifically the decomposition of tyrannical monuments. This wasting process not only decays the vast statue of Ramesses II, but also lays waste to its pretensions, reversing the original meaning of the inscription, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." The poem confronts the vanity of human excess with a vision of infinite waste dispersal, through which the vast waste of the monument yields to a decay that is succeeded in turn by the boundless and bare sands of the desert, hovering above a lone and level horizon of near nothingness. Shelley's wasted desert presents reality as radically contingent through a kind of non-human, infinitely remaindered sublimity in which nothing beside remains. What this ingenious double entendre suggests is not just that nothing remains beside the ruined monument, of course, but also that this monument exists in a world in which there is nothing beside remains. Shelley resists the temptation to recuperate any value from such leftovers, especially in terms of wisdom gleaned or knowledge gained. Wasteful excess, Ozymandias suggests, is absolute, and its losses are irrecuperable. There is only waste in nature, what the German Romantic philosopher Friedrich von Schelling calls the incomprehensible base of reality in things, the indivisible remainder. In being kind of defiantly useless in this way, writers of the Romantic period release the subversive potential of a new kind of literature, what I've been calling literature with a capital L, a literature that, as De Quincey put it, presents the direct and adequate antithesis of knowledge. And perhaps this is why literature in this sense has never managed to quite free itself from the suspicion that its aura of profundity is just a sham. That is to say, that its act of creation ex nihilo, its miraculous production of wisdom from the void, really amounts to a nothing. That its timeless truths are just a waste of both time and energy. And we see this today. It continues in the rumblings from some quarters of government and media that the study of English literature lacks propriety. It is, in other words, not a proper academic discipline. To the extent that it avowedly originates itself from nothingness, however, Romantic literature exposes itself to this charge of wastefulness, to the question, why waste your time with those poems? On one level, this is a charge the Romantics never tire of answering or trying to answer because of power, they say, because of beauty, because of poetic truth, and so on. Shelley's genius, I think, in this poem at least, is to take another tack. He actually turns the tables on propriety by embracing the waste of romanticism, by celebrating, in other words, creativity as waste, whether as wasted time, idleness, or wasted action, daydreaming, aimless wandering, or wasted space, ruins and deserts. For Shelley, this waste constitutes a strange kind of liberation. Only through a kind of radical expenditure, an emptying out or wasting of oneself, can there be freedom. Freedom from relentless productivity, purpose, discipline, and system. Here Shelley would want to adapt the old capitalist adage, you can't get something for nothing. What Shelley's sonnet reveals is that you can't get something without the nothing. Shelley suggests a different possibility for literature, and that is literature as a site of resistance to what he called life, to system, to productivity, to the acquisition of knowledge, and the ruthless domination of nature. In short, to the rebellious enjoyment of literature, capital L literature, as a creative waste of time and space. Thanks very much. Yes, okay, I was doing that.